Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Faith Imperfect, the podcast where we embrace real stories, honest faith, and the beauty of growing in God's grace, even when it's messy. I'm so glad you're here today because this episode is extra special. We're diving into Season 1, Episode 2 of The Chosen. The title is Shabbat, and I'm not doing it alone today. I've got a very special guest with me, my sister Janice. Janice, I'm so excited that you're here.
Me too. Hello, everybody.
So I wanted to ask you before we go on to Episode 2, what did you think about Episode 1?
Well, just for a little background for your listeners, I don't know much about the backstory, so I'm very excited about watching the series and learning more. It was very interesting. I felt like I was kind of on the edge of my seat watching it just because I didn't know, the backstories like most people probably do. So this will be a learning experience for me as well.
Well, and just to ease your mind and the listeners' minds with a lot of that, there is some pieces of the backstories that the director is just kind of making up because there is stuff that we just don't know. Like Mary is in the Bible a couple other times that I won't mention ahead of time, but all they said about Mary Magdalene in the Bible is that she was possessed by demons and was then cured. They don't even really say that it was Jesus that did it. And some of these backstories for the other disciples, we know pieces, but we don't know everything. And so the director did take some liberties to try to fill in some of that to make the characters a little bit richer for us to get more engrossed in the story.
I did find that very interesting, the being possessed by demons, because I think the majority of us that watch TV, we automatically think, oh, that's, it's not real. Things like that can't really happen. So I found that very interesting that was kind of part of the story.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because I used to think the same thing and I thought, but then I've been in Bible studies where people have talked about just the devil and the spiritual warfare. And there is to discussion that the devil's always trying to get to us, not necessarily that we'll be literally possessed with a demon inside of us, but that if the devil gets a hold of too much of us, he can pull us away from God. And that things, that there would be kind of varying levels of maybe not necessarily demon possession, but just us our faith being further from God. I feel like we're getting into a deep topic to start right off, but no, I think that's it's a good point. You don't think that would really be true, but I think there is such a thing as spiritual warfare, though, where, the devil's always trying to get us to sway away from God and not be close with God.
Absolutely.
You were saying something about Mary's name or something with Episode 1?
Yes. So it took almost halfway into the first episode. I couldn't really understand what they were calling her. Later on, I found out that it was Lilith. At first, I thought it was Lily. But then towards the end, when she was actually Mary, I was a bit confused.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. In the notes for the director, I did hear him say, and it's a good parallel. So in a lot of the Bible stories, like with the apostles and different people, before they meet Jesus, even Abraham, Father Abraham had many sons. He was Abram. And when, for some reason, whenever he came close to God, his name got changed to Abraham. There's numerous characters in the Bible that it's almost like after they met Jesus or became a person of God, their name got changed. And so the director sounded like they wanted to do that for Mary. So even though Mary's name in the very beginning scene where you see the little girl with her father, he refers to her, I think he says her name is Mary in that scene. And then when she's possessed by this demon and in this dark part of her life, her name is Lilith. And then when she meets Jesus again, she goes back to her true identity of Mary again. And they wanted to do that parallel to kind of parallel the apostles and other characters in the Bible, but always also to show that she was on this dark side, pulled away from God, pulled away from her true identity, and now she's going back to it, but because she's with Jesus now, or Jesus has came in her life. I think I'm kind of jumping ahead because we haven't really revealed that Jesus was the one at the end of Episode 1, but some of us, I assumed it. Yeah, so I think actually that's a really good point that Lilith, she had a different name and now her name is Mary. And so you'll even notice that later, and not to get too far ahead, but Simon's name will get changed eventually to Peter too. So for some reason in those times, the names changed.
Yes, and I noticed that. So, yeah, because I thought, okay, Peter, I don't really remember a Peter. I thought it was Simon, but it's all making sense. Why do their why are their names being changed?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's supposed to be symbolic of their new identity, like in Christ, kind of
Okay.
thing, you know?
Yeah.
Like, or God's letting them, I don't know if that's their way of like God saying you're mine kind of thing, almost like the way the episode was called, I have called you by name, or you are mine. I don't know if it's something like that. That's a really good question. I'll have to dig into that a little bit more for maybe the next episode and if I get an answer. But that's what I believe it has something to do with like they have like this new identity. So like we won't go into this character in this series. There is a character later in the Bible in Acts when Jesus is no longer on the earth and the disciples are trying to grow the church. There is a person named Saul who's like a murderer and I forget all the details, and he sees Jesus on his path and he gets converted to being a Christian. Like he was persecuting Christians and killing Christians, and then he gets renamed Paul. And it's a part of that as well. So it's just another character in the Bible for, that was one way before they met God or had an intervention with God and then gets converted to now he's Christian, he believes in God, and now his name gets changed. And so like I feel like that happens. There's numerous characters in the Bible for some reason that they do that. Yeah. I'm not real sure. Okay, well, I guess I'll go ahead and go into today's episode. So today's episode is a beautiful shift in pace. It invites us to rest into community and into quiet, sacred moments of faith that often get overlooked. So a lot of it's around simple Shabbat dinner tables. We see stories that unfold, stories of brokenness, belonging, and the kind of love that meets people where they are. So in this conversation, we're going to reflect on what stood out to us, the deeper meanings behind Shabbat, and how this episode speaks to our own lives today, especially when it comes to slowing down, making space for God, and recognizing that we don't have to be perfect to be welcomed. So, whether you've seen the episode or you're just curious about faith, pull up a seat at the table with us and let's get into it. So, the first scene is set in Chinnereth. It says 948 BC. Chinnereth was an ancient fortified city, and it was located on the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee. And it was surrounded by fertile region, is what the notes said. So the opening scene is like this mother, and she's teaching her son Eli about Shabbat, and he's asking her a bunch of questions. And she explains that just as God rested on the seventh day, they rest also to refresh their souls and grow closer to God. So during the gathering, traditional elements of Shabbat are introduced. There's something called the Eshet Shayil, which is Woman of Valor, it's translated to. It's a 22-verse poem from Proverbs, and it's recited to honor the women for their wisdom, strength, and faithfulness, especially as the matriarch of the household. So it's kind of like the woman put all of the stuff together to prepare the Shabbat dinner. They do this Woman of Valor verse. Someone starts to recite it at the beginning. And there's a bunch of that kind of stuff that they do as this Shabbat tradition. So they say that prayer to honor the woman or the mom. Then they do blessings over the sons. And then they have the daughters, they bless them to be like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, which were very, really strong people in the Bible. They talk about a Savta and Saba, which I looked those up, and those are Hebrew names for grandmother and grandfather. They talk about a Ima and Abba, and you'll hear Ima a lot in the future episodes, and that's another name for mother, and Abba is another name for father. So they're talking a lot about family, and so the family and fellow citizens all honor God on Shabbat. And so she tells the son that they rest because on the seventh day, God rested. And then obviously to refresh their souls and get to know God better, which I said already. So with the son's blessing, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. That's from Genesis 48:20. And it's a traditional Jewish blessing that's bestowed on the sons on Friday nights, and it asks that they remain faithful, righteous, and connected to their heritage, even while living in a secular society, like a society that doesn't worship God. And it symbolizes a prayer of fruitfulness as well, and integrity, and being a source of pride. So Manaseeh's name reflects God helping people to forget past troubles and overcome challenges. And then when Jacob was dying in the Old Testament, he adopted two sons, Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, as his own. And then he gave them equal inheritance as his own sons. So like these blessings are supposed to be like coupled with the children being prosperous and also being leaders of their people. So the blessings have like many folds to them that there's a lot of meaning behind them. And with the daughters getting blessed to be like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, those are a broader blessing that they do over the children on Shabbat, where the parents are wishing them strength, faith, and wisdom of those women from the Bible. So Sarah represents strength and faith, Rebecca represents wisdom and foresight, Rachel represents courage and compassion, and Leah is gentleness and grace. And they're foundational role models that are out of the Bible. So they want to connect the new generation of their children to their heritage from back in the day, and that's why they do these blessings. So at the end of the scene, they're all sharing Shabbat dinner, and someone starts reciting the 6 days of God's creation, and I think that's how that also is incorporated into the worship for Shabbat. Did you have anything on that, Janice, that you had any questions on or anything?
There's a lot of names to remember.
Yeah, well, and you're not meant to have to remember them. It's just the
Right.
long part of it, I guess is a good point, is just that it's a lot of people from the Bible, and it's all Old Testament stories. Because if you didn't know, like the New Testament is all stuff after Jesus is born. That's all the New Testament. And Jesus's birth coming, the foretelling of his birth, and it starts with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the Gospels of, and that's all a part of Jesus's life. So everything before that's the Old Testament. And these are all characters from the Old Testament. And the Jewish tradition, they really, I mean, the Old Testament was their whole Bible. There was a couple other things too that they had, but so they really valued the people that are in the Bible too. And so that's really where all that comes from. It's a lot of people from the Old Testament of the Bible.
I did want to comment. I am really excited about like finishing this series so I can learn more and
Yeah.
know the backstory. Because as we were told things, from our grandma and grandpa when we were little, but not as a whole.
Oh yeah, just bits and
At least
pieces.
I don't remember. Right. We just kind of got bits and pieces of it. I'm excited and very interested in it, that I can learn the whole story.
Yeah. And there are things, like I said, where the director took liberties and added in some stuff, but yeah. And I'll try to point those out too as we go as well. Okay, so in this episode, we're going to meet Matthew and Gaius. Now, Matthew, he's in the Bible, but Gaius's name is not in the Bible. Gaius is the Roman soldier escort that takes him around. And in this episode, they're in Quintus's office quarters. And if everybody remembers from last episode, Matthew was at his booth and Simon and Andrew showed up and they were going to pay their taxes. And he tells them, you don't even have enough to cover your penalties. And so then Simon says, well, we have an arrangement with Quintus. And so Matthew wanted to confirm that with Quintus. So him and Gaius are at Quintus's quarters and they're waiting to speak with him. And Gaius, his escort, is like, this is a bad idea. You don't know who you're dealing with. And Gaius is trying to, tell him, you don't know what this guy's capable of. And Matthew thinks that Matthew's a fool and will end up dead because Quintus can be, hot or cold. And if he's hot and he's mad, they could end up dead. So Quintus interrupts them actually and has them follow them into his office. So Quintus says something like, oh, a tax collector and his escort demand to see the praetor, which is him. So he's kind of talking in third person. And it's urgent, a matter of life and death. And Quintus asks him, why shouldn't I kill both of you? And he points to Matthew and says, you first. And so Matthew starts to try to explain what happened with Simon, but Quintus cuts him off right away and says, faster, like he doesn't have the patience to listen. And he continues trying to explain it to Quintus, but Quintus interrupts and says, skip to the end. So Matthew says, "Did you hire a man to spy on Jewish merchant vessels fishing on Shabbat to avoid taxation?" And Quintus stops what he's doing, looks up, and says, "Yes." Quintus asks, "Is he in your district?" And Matthew's like, "Yes." And he's like, his debts are forgiven. Surprise. And Gaius thanks him, the soldier, and starts to kind of silently back away, like, "Okay, let's leave. It's time to go." And Matthew just stands there and says, "As well of those of his brother?" And Quintus says, "Yes, forgiven, goodbye." Like he just dismisses him. And Matthew stands there still and starts going into an explanation that he doesn't find Simon reliable. He says Simon was deficient in his taxes, and when Matthew tried to get him to pay it, he found out that Simon was gambling a lot. And Gaius is nodding his head. Gaius, his little escort, was nodding his head side to side or shaking it side to side, like he doesn't approve of Matthew continuing. He's like, "Oh boy, he's getting in deep." It's kind of the impression you get. And Matthew says that he questions Simon's relationship to the merchants. So Matthew doesn't believe that Quintus has an accurate understanding of what Simon can deliver. And Quintus stares at Matthew. Gaius bows down immediately and starts apologizing for Matthew and the dishonor. And a Roman soldier that's in the room draws his sword and says, "Say your last prayer, Jew," like he's going to kill him. They feel like Matthew's disrespecting Quintus. And Quintus stops him and tells the captain, "Stay where you're at." And Quintus asks Matthew if he's saying that he made a bad deal. And Gaius is still bowed down at the floor, shaking his head side to side, like, "No, no, 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 no." But Matthew's like, "Yes." So you could see Gaius drop his head, like, "Oh no," because he's getting in deeper. And Quintus asks where this guy came from, where Matthew came from, and then asks what sane person would stand up to the Roman Empire. And Matthew says, "I am sane." And Quintus states that Matthew's a different kind of sane, and then he sits down. So everybody in the scene kind of seems to relax. The soldier puts his sword back in its scabbard, and Gaius stands up, and the conversation seems to be lighter now. And so Quintus asks Matthew if he says that Simon isn't Simon really close with these merchants? He says he spends time there, and Matthew tells him that he doesn't know about their social interactions, but it's highly unlikely that a Jew would betray another Jew. So Quintus goes on to tell him, "So says the Jew who collects taxes from them." Matthew starts to try to explain how his situation is different, but Quintus stops him and says he doesn't want to hear it, but he actually admires him for that. So he goes on to say that to date, Simon still hasn't delivered on his end of the bargain. So he's not in breach of anything yet, but he might prove that Matthew's correct, with Matthew saying that he probably won't end up delivering. And then Quintus goes on to ask Matthew his name, which that could be surprising because, he's very dismissive of him and a lot of times could care less, but now he's piqued his interest. So Quintus tells him that since he's got these keen powers of observation, that Quintus might have a special assignment for him. And Gaius, the escort, kind of looks concerned. And I don't know if it's for Matthew or for himself or what, but he has a look of concern on his face. And Matthew seems very like, "Oh, I'll welcome the opportunity." And Quintus is kind of full of himself. And it's like, "Well, of course you would." And so Quintus tells him that he'll be in touch with Matthew, and they both thank each other, which is kind of surprising too. Like, it's very cordial. Matthew thanks Quintus, and Quintus says thanks back. And then Gaius drags Matthew out of there before he could do anything else and dig himself a deeper hole. So, did you have anything with that, Janice? I know I really rambled there.
No, I did actually. I found that whole thing very interesting. So when I watched it, and originally Simon was trying to tell Matthew at the booth, talk to Quintus. He knows that they had this deal going on. My first impression was, oh my gosh, Simon is going to be in so much trouble. He's lying to the tax man, and I thought if Matthew goes and talks to Quintus, that they're going to all be killed because this was just an outlandish lie. I was very shocked to find out that Quintus did honor what he had told Simon. And I was honestly very shocked with the confidence that Matthew had to approach Quintus. Because the way, Gaius was acting was like, we're going to both be killed. So I found that very interesting that Matthew had quite the confidence to confront such a strong person that people would mostly fear. He didn't seem scared at all.
was gonna mention something later, but I'm glad that you brought it up now. When I watched the director's notes, there was talk that he might be, like, on the spectrum and that he wouldn't even pick up on some of these cues. And they think that because he had such keen observation and he was very good, from what I understand, with even in the Bible with documentation and things, that I think they're getting that part right, at least with the documentation, that he was very thorough. And, so some people think that he could have possibly been on the spectrum, and that might be why he would go into situations like that and not be scared. Now, I don't think that specific thing, that's not documented in the Bible, but it, because the story of Simon watching the merchants and all this, and none of that's in the Bible, but I think this is stuff that the director put in there. But I think it's a very interesting angle that they're taking with it.
Absolutely, I agree.
And then the next scene, you see Gaius, and he's walking through the market. So again, Gaius is the soldier that normally escorts Matthew. And he observes two people fighting in front of a Roman soldier. The Roman soldier's kind of hesitant, and Gaius rushes in and knocks one of the men on his head with the hilt of the sword to break up the fight. And the other one backs off, and the soldier thanks Gaius, and Gaius tells him they only speak one language, learn to speak it. And I was kind of like, why did they need to show that episode? Because that was the end of that episode. So I think it might have been to maybe show how the Romans don't want any kind of scene in public. They don't want any kind of uprisings. They don't want any fights breaking out or riots. They have to keep the peace. And so whatever measures they got to take, and I think he's trying to tell some of these other soldiers, whatever measures you got to take, break up the fight. So I'm not sure what else that scene would have been there for, and they didn't talk about that in the director's notes.
And I thought about that too. Maybe they just wanted to show the power
Yeah,
to, of
the Roman
of
occupation.
yes, of the Roman occupation. Thank you. I was trying to think of the
Yeah,
word.
that's a good point.
So then maybe if others seen the chaos, they would know, okay, we're not going to do that because there's going to be consequences.
Yeah. Make an example out of them.
Exactly.
So the next time we see Matthew, he's in his tax booth. Gaius approaches from the outside and he's looking in, and you can see inside that Matthew has a cloth to his face. His cheek has a cut, and Gaius asks if another customer was showing his disapproval. Matthew just answers, I'll be fine, and he's cleaning off his robe. And I'm not sure if the robe has dirt or blood, and Gaius is like, You're disgusting, go home. And Matthew says he has a job to do and that his father never allowed him to shirk his responsibilities. So Gaius tells him he was raised right and tells him he must have Roman blood, which I kind of had to laugh at that. And then Matthew says that him and his father don't speak. And Gaius says that Jews are odd, and Matthew says that people are, which kind of also insinuates a little more to him being on the spectrum, possibly. And Gaius asks how you can have no relationship with your father. Matthew tells him that his father says he has no son, and then Matthew goes about his work. What did you think about that, Janice?
I honestly, I really don't know how I felt about that because we didn't really hear a backstory
Mhm.
on the relationship with Matthew and his father. So I'm assuming that maybe later on that might come out.
Yeah. They do go into it more. I know, I work with a youth group, and we watched this episode today, and we were talking about it today, and it kinda hit me that was like, I wonder if it's because of, he's so hated by everybody for being the tax man. I wonder if that's maybe why the father disowned him too, you know?
Yes, absolutely. I was thinking the same thing.
So later in the evening, we see Matthew. He's carrying something through the street, and a black dog is following him and whining. And Matthew kind of puts his hand out like, stop. And the dog stops. And he tells the dog if there's anything left, he'll give it some. And then he's walking in the dark to a residence. The residence has a fire going and lit candles on the table, and he's kind of peeking in, but he's at a distance. And he doesn't enter or knock. It appears that there's like a mother and daughter sitting down at a table for Shabbat dinner. And then Matthew kind of fidgets, and then he turns around and leaves. Did you have any thoughts on that scene, Janice?
I did not. I'm gonna admit there was a couple scenes that you'll probably realize as we're talking through them that I didn't understand and was wondering why they were put in,
Yeah.
you know? So this was one of them. Yeah.
I think we're gonna get more of the story later too that will help fill some of that in too.
It almost makes me wonder, could that be Matthew's wife and child?
Or family.
Yeah, or family, and maybe since we don't know why, but we know that he doesn't communicate with his father, that maybe there's some other family that he's not communicating with, but he's kind of checking up on them.
Mhm.
I don't know if that sounds weird or not.
No, no, it doesn't. It doesn't sound weird at all. And I got the impression because he was carrying that dish that he was taking food to something, like, I wondered if he was gonna try to go in and then changed his mind, you know?
Right. Like if it was family, maybe it was like a, I want to make peace. I'm bringing a dish to make peace, but then, decides not to. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of that if they follow up on that scene.
Yeah. So the next time, actually, the first time we see Simon in this episode, he's in that establishment, and they keep calling it the establishment, which I'm going to call it's a bar. But they said back in those days they didn't think they actually had bars that existed. And Simon's buying drinks for merchants, and he's joking around with them. And somebody named James and John come in, and Simon tells the bartender, "Make sure James and John get around too." And then he goes to a table that only him and his brother are sitting at, his brother Andrew. And Andrew makes a comment that he is fattening the lambs before the slaughter. Andrew tells Simon it's not a game, and Simon says he's enjoying this temporary break from his doom and his financial hardships because he knows that he's going to have relief from the financial burden that he owes these taxes. He doesn't go into that, but we insinuate that. And then Andrew emphasizes that it is temporary, this temporary happiness that he's putting on a happy face. And Simon tells Andrew that these guys aren't my family. Andrew is, and Eden, which is Simon's wife. He brings up Eden. And then the next time we see Simon and Andrew, they're outside at night. They have kind of like veil things on their heads, and they're watching like the shore, and you can tell Simon's trying to figure out who's out there, who's going out there, who's coming in. And Andrew's like, well, they're coming in because Shabbat is tomorrow, and Andrew says that those are their own brothers. And Simon says that they're dumb kids, and Andrew says he was hoping that this was all a plan to double cross the Romans. And Simon tells Andrew, I don't have a choice. So the next time we see Simon, the scene is Eden, and she's in the house in the kitchen cooking, and it's daylight. And Simon enters, and his hair's all messy, so you kind of give the impression that maybe he just got up out of bed. And he greets her good morning, and she says it's not morning, and she's kind of chopping some stuff, and she chops it in a way where like you could tell she's mad. And she asks how fishing was, and he says good. And she's surprised and points out that he hasn't taken any fish to market for days. She's wondering what's going on, and he hasn't sold anything at the market, and his hours are odd, and he's always worried. And he tells her that they're in a challenging season and he needs to work harder and will get caught up tonight. And then she gets upset that he's going to go work on Shabbat. And they argue a little bit. He tells her to trust him, and he tells her, I've got this. And she says to him that he has to answer to God, but that the next time he'll answer to both her and God. Did you have anything to add on that, Janice?
I think I was just going to say that I think I remembered from when I watched it that I was shocked that Simon kind of seems like, and I don't know if this is the word to use, kind of maybe like a backstabber. Like he's going to end up doing something wrong to his own people. And I guess I have to watch more, to see what happens. But obviously, he's kind of acting as a spy for Quintus.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like from how Andrew talks that they're like their own people. So why would you do that to your own people?
Yeah.
I feel like Simon's going to end up in a lot of trouble. I just feel like
Mm-hmm.
he'll be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, and it's when they talked about that, so in the, with the director at the if you watch online, they have these roundtable discussions with the director. The rabbi says too, like, it would be very rare for one, for them to work on Shabbat, because he actually believes that Simon was seeking God already at that point before he met Jesus. And he doesn't think that he would have violated Shabbat. He thinks it would have had to be really drastic. And he didn't even sound like he thought that any of these circumstances were drastic enough to warrant that. And the same thing, that these were their own people. So they're all those Jewish people were being suppressed by the Romans. So they were against the Romans. So for him, yeah, for him to be helping the Romans, like, they were just like, yeah, that's probably wouldn't have been the case. He probably wouldn't have done that. And just like Matthew tells Gaius, it's very unlikely a Jew would set up his brothers or go or turn in another Jew. So we do hear that from different angles. So that's a good point.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, I feel like that maybe Simon is so in trouble with back taxes and obviously is scared of Quintus and what he might do, that maybe Simon's willing to go like extra measures, even if it's backstabbing his own people to try to get out of his tax debt.
Yeah, and that's
What do
actually
you think of that?
exactly what the director was going for. So even though those theologians said, we don't think this would happen, the director was saying, I wanted it to feel, and that's exactly what you picked up on. I wanted it to feel like he felt he had no choice, and he wanted to add a little bit of drama to the series. So that's also why he wanted to do that. And it's neat that you did pick up on that too.
Yes, I definitely did. I also wanted to include in that kind of throughout the whole thing, and maybe this wasn't the right time to add it in, but there is a little bit of comedy
Oh,
throughout, the couple of episodes that I did watch. Like, I don't remember exactly what it was, but I remember Nicodemus made a funny joke to somebody and they didn't get it. And Nicodemus was like, it was a joke. So I find it kind of cool that they
yeah.
kind of threw in like a little bit of comedy as well.
Yeah. Yeah, there are gonna be different parts where they add some comic relief. Um, so the next time we see Mary, or the first time we see Mary in this episode, it's the city of Capernaum, and it's AD 26. AD 26, not AT 26. You see Mary Magdalene, and she's helping women get ready in what looks like a hair salon of that time. She goes out to pick some flowers to use in their hair, and Joseph, one of the Pharisees, who knew Nicodemus had tried to heal Mary in episode 1, sees her and he looks shocked. And he's from afar, and that's all you see. And then the scene changes. The next scene you see is Nicodemus, and he's reading in like a candlelit area, and the caption says demons and exorcism. So again, he's reading and writing and studying about demons and exorcism. He's still really caught on this whole thing with Mary, or Lilith, and how he couldn't heal her. And he gets interrupted and he scrambles to put the papers away. Shmuel tells him that the judges of the Sanhedrin sent for him. He says that Avet Biat Din requests your presence. And I looked up what that is. It's the father of the court. It's the second highest ranking member of the Sanhedrin. And Nicodemus looks shocked, but not in a good way. Shmuel says something like, well, God is good, like this is a good thing. But Nicodemus looks really worried, and he's like, what happened? And so there's tense music playing, and you see Nicodemus heading out. He's got a line of Pharisees following behind him. And when he gets to the Sanhedrin, or the court, whatever you want to call it, he greets the Av Biat Din and asks what the urgent matter is. And the man tells him that they're considering a formal inquiry. And I looked what that meant too. I was like, well, what does that mean? And it sounds like that means that they're assessing whether this matter is serious enough to warrant an official investigation. And what that would mean is that they would get together a panel of judges, and there would be formal, like, legal proceedings according to Jewish law. So there's like a lot involved in that. So Nicodemus seems a little bit alarmed, and he's like, what are the charges? And they respond with, a miracle, Rabbi of rabbis. And he points to Joseph and he says that this man's testimony is clear, his account miraculous. He goes on to tell Nicodemus that the woman in the red quarter who he offered rights to is redeemed. And Nicodemus is shocked. He's like, "You saw her?" And Joseph says, "Yes, teacher, perfectly restored and radiant." Nicodemus asks where, and he responds, "At the hairdresser's at the market." And Nicodemus says something like, "Well, men aren't allowed in there." And he's like, "No, she was on an errand and she came out." He said he thought he was seeing things, so he followed her to be certain. And the Av Beit Din said that it was unparalleled revelation. And he even points out, too, and that's why I kind of stressed it in episode 1, that even Nicodemus said himself that she was so far gone that she was beyond human aid. And so Nicodemus is saying, "Can I investigate it myself before you guys do?" And they say, "Yeah, we will honor that, but we want to know why." And he says, "Well, since the exorcism took some time to be effective, it might only have a tentative hold." And he says the woman might be in shock to be poured over by all these judges who are doing the investigation. And so he's like, also like that his face is familiar. And then the leader says, "Yes, you can conduct the investigation, but be efficient. These kind of things grow legs." And that's where that scene ends. Did you have something, Janice?
I did. I was just going to comment on how I thought it was amazing the transformation that, let's say, Lilith made into Mary, or however you want to word it. Yeah, it was just because she seemed so incapable of healing when Nicodemus first met her that it seemed like a drastic change seeing her like in that courtyard picking the flowers. She seemed happy and free, obviously free of demons and peaceful. It's very peaceful. And I also noticed that the ladies at the hairdressers were even treating her nicer, like they were accepting of her.
Mhm.
I guess my question is, did they know Mary before when
Well,
she was possessed by demons? So did they notice the drastic change with her?
yeah, they don't ever go into that, but I assume that they did. They probably knew something was going on. And you notice like later on, we see the next scene where she goes back into that tent where those ladies are, or she goes into a tent with a box and she's talking about the Shabbat candles that she got. A woman's like kind of shocked, like, "You, Shabbat candles?" Like she didn't exactly word it that way, but it does get you the idea that they knew her before, but they're, like, still super accepting. Everyone seems like they're helping her. They're not, like, being critical of her. Like, when she starts talking about dinner, they're like, "Oh, you have to start your preparations early, and you have to get your bread ready and get your fire," and they're trying to give her advice. And so they sound like they know like, they knew her, but they don't actually acknowledge that. They just say, "Oh, it's been a while since she's celebrated Shabbat." So it's a good point. I think they might have known her, but they never really go into that. The one lady in that episode 1 that did know her did make the comment that when she's not having her episodes, she's really sweet, but then when she has these episodes, so maybe everybody else knew her, both I'm guessing before too.
Right. And it seems like they're just very accepting and inviting of her now. Like they know this could be a new beginning for her and they're just accepting her, as she is now.
Yeah. You kind of get that sense of community because I do think they are trying to show that in this episode that the Jewish community, especially with Shabbat, they come together as community, and you kind of see that with these women trying to help her and accepting her.
Yes, absolutely.
So in that episode, when the woman tells Mary that she says to the other woman that it's Mary's first Shabbat dinner in a little while, Mary acknowledges that it has been a long time and she barely remembers how to do it. One of the women tells her she'll be great. The other one tells her she'll know how to, tells her how to make the bread. And then the women tell her that if she's hosting, like she better get moving on her preparations and everything. And she seems surprised. So they tell her to get going and start her fire. And then they all say like the Shabbat Shalom, which is like peace of the Sabbath to you, is what the Shabbat Shalom means. And they all greet each other. So then she's leaving that area with her stuff and is almost immediately greeted by Nicodemus. And he's shocked. And he tells her that he ministered to her and he calls her Lilith. And she's like, I don't go by that name. My name is Mary. And I was born Mary. And he says, but you were Lilith, yes? And she tells him, please, I must go. And he tells her that he's desperate for her help. He says that he's a Pharisee visiting from Jerusalem. He says he's a man of God. And he says that he believes that she experienced a miracle. And she asks if he really is a Pharisee. And he tells her, yeah, and that he isn't there to enforce Jewish law. And she says she doesn't remember him, and she says she can't go back to that. And he's like, no, 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 I don't want you to, but you are healed, that much is clear. So Nicodemus tells her that he wants to understand how it happened, and she tells him that makes two of us. And he says to her, how long after his visit did she feel the change? And that's when she tells him that it wasn't anything he did. She says it was someone else, and you can tell that Nicodemus is genuinely shocked and repeats, someone else? And then she said, he called me Mary, and then she starts getting emotional. And she says, he said, I am his and I am redeemed. And Nicodemus said, and it was so? And she's still kind of crying a little bit and nods. And he says, who did this? And Mary says that she doesn't know his name, and even if she did, she couldn't tell him. And Nicodemus asks, why not? And then Mary responds with, his time for men to know has not yet come, which is actually, I feel like this whole thing isn't in the Bible, but I feel like that particular phrase is said by Jesus in other stories where he doesn't want people to tell anyone that he healed them. So it's kind of interesting that they used that here too. So it sounds like just something Jesus would have said. So when she says it's his time for men to know has not yet come, Nicodemus kind of starts to repeat that and says he performs miracles and seeks no credit. And then he has a lot of questions. He's like, what does he look like? Is he a member of the Sanhedrin? Would you know him if you saw him? And Mary laughs, and she says she doesn't know why she's sharing with him. And she says she doesn't understand it. She just knows that I was one way, and now I'm completely different. And the thing that happened in between was him. And so she says, yes, I will know him for the rest of my life. And then she tells him that she has to get home and prepare for Shabbat. And he laughs and he says, you're so mended, you're even hosting Shabbat. And then they greet each other with the Shabbat Shalom, and then they part. Did you have anything to add there, Janice?
I did. I just wanted to say that I thought that when she met up with Nicodemus, that it was I felt a very emotional scene there. Of course, I'm a emotional person sometimes anyway when I
Yeah.
am watching certain things. But I guess it's just amazing how I couldn't imagine how Nicodemus viewed her after the last time he had met her. He must have just been in complete awe over her transformation.
Yeah, I think the actor did a great job. Like, I never, I remember reading the name Nicodemus in a couple of different stories in the Bible, and never thought twice about him. But this actor really brings it to life. The shock on his face, the genuine intrigue, and yeah, I felt the same way. I know I get emotional with stuff too, but I was like, I felt like that was real powerful. That was a powerful scene, and I liked the quote of, "I was one way before and different now, and he was what happened," and I liked that. I thought that was a powerful scene too.
Yes, absolutely. And I was curious, um, does Mary know that she was basically introduced to Jesus? Or does she not know yet?
Well, I mean, she knows something big happened, I think. And at the end of this, I mean, we're getting close to that part. She still doesn't know his name yet, even in this scene, right? So it's not
Right.
till like they're at Shabbat dinner that she learns his name. I'm sure she knows something big happened and it changed her life, right?
Just doesn't really know who he is yet.
I
Yeah.
She just doesn't realize the significance of it.
Right.
So after they part, the next time we see Nicodemus, he's inside this temporary residence because he doesn't live in Capernaum. Remember in episode 1, him and his wife were traveling in that man-carried chariot thing to Capernaum. So they're at this temporary residence, and there's members of the Sanhedrin that are pretty high up seated inside at the table. And his wife is in there, and she's telling them about these dinner plates, and they're solid gold, and they're from Jerusalem, and she hopes they enjoy eating from them, and they all look like, ooh. And Nicodemus is kind of observing from afar. And he's shaking his head side to side, and he turns and he looks at this tapestry that's hanging on the wall. And his wife, Sahara, goes to him and asks him what's on his mind. And he talks about Hasmonean. And he tells his wife about that 200 years ago that all of them, their people were ruled by this Greek king Antiochus the Fourth, and that he suppressed their religious observances. And so they weren't allowed to worship and do their typical religious practices. And it wasn't until the Maccabees revolted and ushered in this Hasmonean dynasty that their worship was restored. And then as he's looking at that tapestry, then he quietly looks over to the table with all those Pharisees, and he's like, "Who's responsible for suppressing our worship now?" And he says that he fears he knows the answer. So you get that impression. And then Zahara says that it's a beautiful tapestry. You could tell she kind of wants to change the topic. And she asks him if the artist should have made it less beautiful. For what purpose? For sadness, for a conquered people. And he smiles and tells her that she's wise and beautiful. And then some guests arrive and they see Nicodemus and they say that they are honored and that he makes them whole. And he gets upset. He's got this serious look. He's like, only God can do that. And then he starts the Sabbath tradition by reciting that Woman of Valor verse. That's the 22 verses about the matriarch of the household. So he's starting that tradition. So I thought that was kind of interesting because, he's wrestling with this whole thing where he's trying to figure out if there is more than what they understand, just based on, when he tried to help Lilith and things, and now knowing Lilith got healed. And you could tell he's starting to kind of question, but like anytime that people raise questions because they were so rigid in their not just a tradition. There is something to tradition, but sometimes I think he's feeling like they're putting themselves in a box and they're not allowed to think outside of it. And he's wondering if there's just more to it than what we see than what they see.
I think you summarized that up pretty good. I agree with all of that. And I didn't really have anything. It seemed like at that point they were kind of switching between that scene and like what Mary was doing at her
Mhm.
dinner.
At the end, they're actually going between multiple places so you can see how everybody is celebrating Shabbat. So the next scene, you do see Mary. She's setting the table in her place for Shabbat, and there's a knock at the door, and there's somebody named Barnaby. She says, "Hi, Barnaby," and he's using a crutch, and he looks like he's got like a limp or something. And then another guest named Shula arrives, and she's carrying a cane, and you learn in the dinner that she's blind because Barnaby introduces her to people. And then there's this James and Thaddeus that show up at her door, and you can tell Mary doesn't know who they are, but they tell her that they were told it was a good place to come. And she's welcoming and she allows them in. They say, "Well, if it's awkward, we can leave." And she goes, "No, no, no, we come in." And they ask her if they can help, and she says no, but then she's like, "Well, just let me know if what I'm doing is correct," because she feels like she was fumbling. And they say, "Well, there's food, and that's a great start." She tells them, "Let me know if I'm doing anything wrong." And Barnaby says that he's been to a Shabbat dinner, but he's never been invited to one before. And he asks who the extra seat is for, and Mary answers Elijah. And she says that she remembers that her mother would always leave an extra seat for Elijah. And James and Thaddeus say that that's only for Passover. And she asks if the first star is out, and I guess that means that now it's nightfall. And Barnaby says, "Yes, let's eat," so that they can start Shabbat. Well, then there's a knock at the door, and it's the man who helped Mary. And Mary is shocked at his presence, and she stands in the doorway, and he finally asks if he can, before he could finish his sentence, she's like, "Yes, yes, yes, come in, come in." And so she's surprised to see him because she was standing there. It was kind of like an awkward silence, and that's when he asked if he could kind of come in. And it turns out that James and Thaddeus already know him as a rabbi. And Mary is surprised. And he says, "Well, these are students of mine." And so Mary tells her friends that this is the man who helped her. And Shula says that Mary has told them a lot about him. And he says, "I hope not too much." And Barnaby introduces himself and then Shula, and that's when he says, and Shula's blind. And then Mary says, "I'm sorry, but I don't actually know your name." And so then he finally introduces himself as Jesus of Nazareth. So that's when we learn that, yes, his character is Jesus of Nazareth. And Barnaby makes a comment joking, "Well, apparently something good can come out of Nazareth." A lot of people didn't look very highly on Nazareth back in those days. And he laughs, but no one else does. They all have these looks like, "What?" And then Jesus winks at him, which I thought was kind of cute. And then Jesus tells Mary that he's honored to be there, and he tells Mary that she should begin. And she says, now that he's there, that he should do it. He's like, this is your house, and I would love for you to do it. So she starts to read about the Sabbath day. So while she's reading, we see these scenes of Nicodemus at his Shabbat dinner with all these Pharisees and gold plates, Matthew in the street with this dog, sharing his dinner on the street with a dog, Simon and Andrew at their table with Eden at Shabbat dinner. And then you see Simon getting up from the Shabbat dinner, kissing Eden. You could tell Eden looks very upset, disapproving, and he's leaving, so we all know where he's going. And then as she's finishing the reading, she says amen, and Jesus does too, and everyone at her table says amen. And then you see the very last scene of Simon at the water's edge, Roman soldiers walking up beside him with torches, and then he looks over at them and back at the water, and there's some pretty intense music, and then the episode ends. So I know I kind of rushed the ending there, but I figured we were close enough to it, I would just finish out the episode. So what did you think about the scene with Jesus showing up, Janice?
Well, I wanted to mention that before that, when the two gentlemen showed up and told Mary that they heard this was a good place to be, I remember thinking, I wonder who told them that,
Yeah.
because obviously she didn't know them and she was shocked they showed up at her home. But then when Jesus showed up, it kind of made sense because I felt like, well, obviously those were his students. So maybe they were informed by Jesus, hey, you need to come to this Sabbath dinner.
Mhm.
Trust me, you'll be welcome there. I, I don't know. I guess I have kind of a whirlwind of feelings. Like I thought it was really neat that he showed up and that Mary got to see him again. You could tell she's very thankful for what he did for her.
Actually, that's a great point, because actually scenes like this do happen again where people don't even know it, but Jesus was orchestrating a gathering, and and the people hosting it sometimes wouldn't even know it's coming. They're like inviting people to this dinner, and the dinner's not even planned yet, but he already has the plans laid out ahead. So it's actually no, it was good that you brought that up, because that is, I think, what happened. Because yeah, when you first meet them, like, well, why would these people just randomly show up at her place? But yeah, obviously when Jesus gets there and they know each other, then you know that he had to have invited them, right? And again, none
Yeah,
of this is in the Bible. This is stuff that the director did, but I still really like what he did and how he's bringing these characters in.
absolutely.
I don't think I asked you this about episode 1. What was your first thought on Jesus when you saw his character? And I'm assuming you assumed it was him in episode 1, but now that we know it's him now in episode 2, what were your thoughts? Is he what you pictured Jesus would look like?
So it's funny that you ask because I was actually going to start commenting before you asked me that. So as a little girl, we heard stories from our grandma and grandpa and seen pictures that they had hanging up in their house of what Jesus looked like. And I always imagined him to have the long brown hair and kind of the, mustache goatee thing going on. So he was exactly how I imagined him. But it's interesting how people act when they're around him. They're calm. They're just like in awe. Like you could tell this is Jesus. He's got this calming effect over people. I guess I'm kind of just speechless. Like I don't know the word.
Well, and I think that's exactly what it would be, because I always wondered that too. If we lived in those days and we met him, would we be speechless too? Because I
Right.
bet you they had to have known there's something larger here, you know?
Exactly. Well, and that's exactly what I was going to say. Like you could tell from watching the series that there's just this overcoming of calmness and just at peace in his presence. And I think that that would be just an interesting, just very interesting to experience. I don't know that I ever experienced that. Maybe one day I will. But you could just tell, like watching it, that he is exactly how you dream of him being.
Yeah, and it's funny because I was telling the youth group today too. I got to thinking, when Jesus was standing at the doorway, do you remember that picture hanging in Boucha's kitchen of Jesus knocking on a door? I immediately
Yeah.
thought of that picture with Jesus standing in the doorway. He knocked on the door, he's standing there waiting, and she's at the door, and I immediately thought of that, like, and I know that that picture is supposed to represent, like, us allowing Jesus into our hearts and stuff, but I feel like it's also like, that episode kind of was symbolic of that too, you know?
Yeah. And that was one thing that I actually thought of a different image. So I remember our grandma Busha having a picture hanging up that was like Jesus in the clouds with like a bright sunrise behind him. I don't know if you remember that. And I think maybe his arms were kind of down and out and his head was a little bowed, like he was like welcoming.
Mhm.
I don't know how to explain it. But that's the image that I thought of when I seen him. And I just thought that that was really neat that, oh my gosh, he's got the long brown hair and the brown facial hair and it reminds me just of the picture from when I was a little girl looking at it on the wall.
Yeah. Yeah, when we were in youth group talking about it, I asked some of the kids, and one of them said he looked a little bit different. And I said, "Well, how?" Because I feel like a lot of the pictures are very similar to what we're saying, the long hair, brown hair, and stuff like that. And he says, "Well, just he looks like everybody else in the episode, like he blends right in. He doesn't look different. I would have thought he would have looked different. And maybe he did look different, but maybe he didn't. And maybe the difference is like what you're saying. Maybe the encounter and how you feel with him would have been different, but not necessarily how he looked. Like he didn't stand out in the crowd by how he looked, you know?
Right. And I agree with that child that said that to me because they almost make it in this series that they kind of want him to blend in.
Mhm.
They don't want obviously anybody to feel alarmed. So I feel like they did a very good job of blending him in with the others and his surroundings. But I think it's the feeling you get when you see him and, like with Mary's encounter, there's
Yeah.
just something that overcomes you that makes you feel that he has a higher power.
Yeah, it's funny because one of the questions I was gonna say, this is from one of the Bible studies I found. We are being shown each of the characters before Jesus is in their life. What does an encounter with Jesus do to people? And I feel like that all plays into that. Like, obviously, when these people are encountering him, he has this, like, way of, like, lulling everybody or you know what I mean? Like, bringing them peace,
Right.
and they're all of a sudden, calm and at peace and in awe. I think I got through everything I wanted to talk about. I guess the only other thing is I did have some extra notes about Shabbat itself. I know I talked a lot already about it, but I did look up the significance of Shabbat. And there was like these 5 pillars. It's meant to be a memorial of the creation, so the 6 days and resting on the seventh day. It's a sign of a covenant, which is our relationship with God. Shabbat is explicitly called a sign between God and the Israelites in Exodus, marking them as a people consecrated to God. So it's a day that is explicitly set apart from the secular work week or the week for holiness and focused worship of God. And then the third pillar was a remembrance of liberation. So in Deuteronomy, back in Exodus, they were under Pharaoh's rule and they were slaves. And when they were finally freed from Pharaoh's power, this was also to commemorate that God delivered them out of Pharaoh's power and then took care of them on their journey to the promised land of where they were supposed to eventually thrive. And it is interesting that this when they mandated that this day of rest happen, it wasn't just for the people, but it was their servants, their animals, strangers, everybody was expected to stop working. And it said here that it made it a unique revolutionary humanitarian law in the ancient world. And then the fourth pillar is a test of trust, our dependence on God. It's about provision over production. So instead of being worried about getting stuff done, it was supposed to show us that we rest on the seventh day. And so what's interesting is in the early parts of the Bible, when God was providing food for the people in the desert, this manna and it sounds like it was almost like a dew on the ground that was almost like a cracker. I don't even fully understand what exactly it was, but like there was this manna that would appear in the mornings, and they would collect it up and they would eat that, and that's how he got them through in the desert. And on the sixth day, it would be double the amount, and they'd collect it all, so that on the seventh day they wouldn't even go collecting the manna. And they would just have this, so the seventh day they could rest. So I thought that was kind of interesting too. And then the last piece is spiritual and physical restoration. So beyond the legal aspect, the Bible highlights the Sabbath day as a day just to be rather than doing. And so you can restore your body and soul from the exhaustion of the week. And then you're supposed to take like delight in this time that you spend toward God instead of it being a burden. I didn't know if you have anything else you want to add.
No, not really. I just wanted to kind of make a little, I don't know, a little comment. Like, when you watch The Chosen and you see how they gather for a meal, I really like that. I've always liked like family tradition stuff. And I wonder like how many people today in our time do that, and if any still do that anymore. I think it would be like just a really cool thing for families to get together on a Sunday and have that day of relaxation and peace and time with your family. I guess it just kind of makes me wonder. Obviously, the Chosen is backstories from, back in the day. It just makes you wonder like how many people today in our world actually still do that.
It does sound like with the Jewish culture that they still try to observe Shabbat like that. Now, I don't know if it's the exact same degree, but it does sound like they try to do that. And I think we do that like with holidays, but as far as on a regular basis, yeah, I mean, I think that's probably something that has changed over time, where people probably don't do it as much, and back in those days, I mean, I think you probably even invited neighbors in, and there was probably more of a sense of community than there is now. It does seem like that, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I feel like, too bad that that tradition couldn't keep going,
Yeah.
that families would get together with, or friends and neighbors and just get together for a meal. And I don't know, maybe it's a goofy thing.
No,
It's
it's
just something
not.
that I think about when I'm watching it.
No, it's a good point because there was a question in here about like which I'm trying to find it, but it's exactly to the same point that like we have so much going on. I think it's like there's so many more distractions, and you know what I mean, that it feels like it's harder to do that kind of stuff now. You really have to make an effort to have time for stuff. I think it is just part of how times have changed, but hopefully people can make time for that.
Yeah. Well, I am looking forward to watching more of the episodes
Yeah.
and having more conversations.
Yeah, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And the next episode is titled, I believe, Jesus Loves the Little Children. We'll see everybody for episode 3.